This is the Leadership in Insurance podcast, brought to you by FinPro Search Partners.
Insurance companies are businesses and they need to look for the long term and be sustainable.
We went from 0 to 1 and now it's going from 1 to 100.
Insurance as a concept, as a kind of service, is brilliant. The execution is what we're looking at now. I think the companies that are going to succeed are the ones that are going to understand and master the art of intent. When we talk about innovation, we lean too heavily to think about technology, and we don't think about creating a culture of innovation.
I think innovation is essentially continuous improvement of existing processes and platforms and product.
Right? It's got to be easy. It's got to be seamless.
Hello and welcome to the Leadership in Insurance podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bond, and I'm very lucky today to be joined by Will Johnson, CEO of Gyde. Will, how are you, sir? Good to see you.
Fantastic. Alex, thanks for having me. Really excited to be joining.
Yeah, no, and I am as well. I think we're going to touch all of the buzzwords. Buzzword bingo is going to happen today. But we're going to get behind that. But look, before I dive into it, well, we're lucky enough to spend a bit of time talking to each other the other week. But for those people out there that don't know either yourself or Gyde as a business, it'd be great if you could introduce, both sides.
Yeah, so we'll start with me, and then that'll be a nice kind of segue into Gyde. So Will Johnson, co-founder and CEO of the company. Previously, I spent 10 years at Oscar Health, which is an insurance business largely focused on the individual under 65 health insurance market here in the US, but also dabbled in Medicare Advantage, some fully insured small group during kind of my tenure. And during the course of that decade-long period, I spent a lot of my time on distribution and just kind of like market P&L ownership. And the thing that we saw, at least from my vantage point, in a very visceral way, is that the broker really was what I would call the entry point to these systems of insurance, healthcare, financial services for these consumers that really are, in many respects, looking to these advisors, these essential guides, hence the name of our company now, to help provide them the support they need to navigate the challenges, conundrums, and fun wrinkles that are presented to them through the insurance, healthcare, financial services ecosystem that we have here in the US. My vision was to empower those same brokers to become even stronger, more comprehensive guides for their clients. Because one of the things that we saw on the ground was, as much as they would like to have solved more of those clients' challenges, so think issuing other insurance products to them, helping them navigate their wealth management questions, even finding ways to, walk their way through the US healthcare system. And I say walk is somewhat of a joke because it's a complete disaster, as you can appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that if you gave those same guides the tooling, platforms, et cetera, to become or achieve that ambition that I just articulated, you could help to transform the system. And so that really became the kind of founding vision for Gyde, which was, again, the broker is an essential entry point to the system. They lack the technological infrastructure that we were seeing in other kind of elements of that same value chain. So they weren't getting the AI tooling clinicians or the payers are getting. But if they did, we believe that they could, as that essential kind of key entry point to the system, change the experience for consumers, employers, and anyone that's trying to navigate the complexities of insurance, wealth, and healthcare here in the States.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and I think walkthrough is I mean, I have a very personal experience of this, and for anyone that knows me will know that one of my things that cut short my time living in the US was having a medical complication and it not being covered by my health insurance, which was, I think, eight to 10 times more expensive than the coverage that I have here, for less coverage, which I don't think is any surprise to anyone, but it shows you the role of a broker, which is quite unique as well. I think most people in the UK will not purchase insurance for a broker on a personal level, but the healthcare system is so complex that that's where you need that trusted advisor, and people still clearly value that role as well. Does that impact actually the business as well? That's what I was trying to think about, was that you've got these very personal relationships. So, do people still have a quite a valued relationship with their broker when it comes to things like healthcare coverage?
Agree. And in many respects, they're the first call, and at Oscar, which is an organization I continue to have a ton of respect for. Still have lots of, colleagues that are there, and they've done incredible. I mean, even the past open enrollment results, I think, are a testament to what they've been building. But we spent a significant portion of our time building engagement solutions for these populations. But oftentimes the broker, even with all of that investment, was the first call, because what you realize is they are the payer agnostic entity. You as a health insurance carrier, you might have these members for 1, 2, 3 years at a time. If the broker is enabled to provide kind of a lifelong service to these consumers and employers, these folks are on the books for 40 years, if we did it correctly. And so in many respects, the insurance carrier will just never be able to have the same degree of relationship with these consumers as the broker does, because the nature of the way they work with that entity is just fundamentally different. Right? The broker is a trusted lifelong advisor. The insurance carrier is oftentimes a financial product.
Yeah, very much so. And so, I mean, talk to us about an AI native brokerage. How do you define that? What is that broker of, well, I was about to say broker of the future, but it's not a broker of the future. This is a broker of now. What does that
Broker
look like?
now. Yeah, and maybe the best way to think about what the broker, of now looks like is actually to look at what it used to look like. Right. So if you think about core challenges for any agency, whether they're servicing a Medicare Advantage population, employee benefits population, small group, large group, et cetera, the challenges are actually fairly consistent across almost anybody you talk with, right? Managing your renewing book is not getting any easier, whether that's having to call all of those consumers if you're servicing a Medicare Advantage book, for example, after huge benefit disruption this past AEP and presumably more coming for next AEP, and talking to each of those consumers about what's changing and what their new plan options are is an incredibly laborsome process during an AEP or Q4 window where all of that activity has to take place, during that very short and finite period of time. You can easily see situations where, and we see this every day, your book gets so big as a broker, all you can do is service the renewing cohort. Right. And this goes for the brokers that are servicing, employers as well. Right. They've got to go look at the rate increases of the book across the groups that they service. They can't go through and find, the renewing quotes and rates for like every single group that they're working with. And so in many respects, they just do the best that they possibly can to, analyze the book, find the right products for these folks that are getting large rate increases, and then place them accordingly. It's an extraordinarily difficult process, again, in a very finite time window where a lot of the enrollment and renewal activity takes place. Then let's say you actually get these folks moved to the right product for their needs, you then got to service it, right? So more liquidity in these markets creates more service and admin burden. So you've got to go build tooling to service those clients that might have moved. And then finally, you'd like to get these folks to a place where they're not just selling one line of business. If you go talk to 100 brokers, in the employer space, they might be loading a few different products into the ben admin tool, fine. But many of them are really 90% like one product line. So that's what they're dealing with, right? So how do we get them to where, we would think of as a kind of guide empowered broker? It's one way that we like to call it kind of internally. Well, you've got to find ways to automate that renewal process, make it more seamless for the consumers and for the broker to both identify the right product for that customer, and then ultimately get them into an enrollment environment or automate the entirety of that process on behalf of the broker, where the consumer, the employer, is getting into the right product, and it's not taking the broker, hours, if not days, of their time simply just to conduct that one task. Then you build automation for client service, right? So both in the form of employee or consumer-facing functionality that helps to answer some of those high-frequency, low-complexity questions, but also co-pilot and even what we'd call now autopilot, like infrastructure for the broker and the account managers to find answers to questions that they get inbound, and then dynamically get those answers back to the stakeholder that's asking them in a fashion that's pretty quick. And then finally, on cross-sell, it's really just about identifying opportunities where it's appropriate for the consumer to have other products, and then finding ways to automate, to the degree possible, the entirety of the process of getting them into those additional products. So not only does it help the broker kind of expand the ARPU or kind of value of that customer over the duration of the lifetime that you service them, but it is very good for the client. As we continually see benefits get watered down year over year, we need to have product-driven solutions to solve these, what we would call benefit or coverage gaps that seem to be emerging year after year.
Yeah. Um, I can see the need for it, obviously, completely. But forgive me if I'm wrong on the model. Are you like are you trying to ingest brokers into your platform to build the brokerage to be AI native, or are you just giving them the tools, or is it a combination of both? Because if I read the website, it's kind of there's a lot there which I completely believe on. It's like everyone's
Yeah.
building towards an exit event, which is really difficult to achieve. But yeah, you rolling books in and then empowering them, or you operating as a tech operating system. What's the structure? Just so we got clarity on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think first and foremost, we are acquiring the partners that we work with. So we are a business that is conducting M&A.
Yeah,
Full stop. That is the go-to-market
yeah,
motion that we have today. Now, a couple of things. One, we'll have a combination of a few wholesalers, so FMO, GA profiles, and then a lot of agencies that write kind of more retail, right? Directly to that consumer or directly to that employer. So in many respects, the answer to your question is a little bit of both, right? So as a wholesaler, we'll have brokers that, write through some of our partners that will get access to some fraction of the technology as a part of that relationship. And then we'll have the agencies that we work with, that are selling directly to consumer and employer, where we partner operationally and in a very hands-on way with those partners to ultimately drive growth together. And a big part of our promise is, look, we're not getting rid of the owners whenever we buy these businesses. The reason we're buying them is because we believe deeply in them and the value that they add to the system. And we believe we have an imperative to support them with both the platform that we've kind of talked about, Gyde OS, GIA, and some of the functionality around those, but also with our people.
mm,
Big part of our operating model is actually getting folks with dedicated support mechanisms in the form of real people to help them solve day-to-day problems, work with carriers, etc.
yeah, yeah. What's been the pushback on that? Because I'm thinking as essentially I'm a small recruitment business owner. Like we always get in those kind of roll up opportunities, and we sort of sit there and like we like hiss like it's the devil coming over. So you might, yeah, yeah. What's the pushback been like? Is it just cultural? And I suppose the argument is if there's pushback, they're not the right partners, and that's part of it.
Yeah.
Um, but has it evolved since you've started this process, or has your messaging changed? I was just kind of wondering how that kind of pushback has settled.
What's been interesting is our messaging actually hasn't changed at all.
No,
In many respects, I think the vision when we started and kind of what we're delivering today is remarkably consistent. And I
yeah,
think part of that is because many of us came from the space. If you
yeah,
think about my co-founder, who's been an incredible partner on this journey, and Sam, we worked together for 6 years at Oscar. He went off and was with the Medicare Advantage FMO for the following three, and then came over and of course in partnership together helped kind of build what is now Gyde. And then if
mhm,
you look at across the team, there's a lot of folks with consistent companies in their DNA, and as a part of being with those companies, they have a lot of experience in healthcare, fintech, et cetera. So you'll see Oscar, Stripe, et cetera, as a part of those who are in the business. And so these are not necessarily like industry outsiders, for lack of a better term.
mm,
They're kind of industry insiders that are, yes, for sure, commercially oriented, of course, but perhaps most importantly, have a large kind of missionary orientation around the impact we could have on the system if we do this correctly. And so I think that's probably why whatever it is, 9 months later, since our initial funding, the vision is actually pretty consistent. I think if anything, we've just said, hey, how can we go accelerate this even further, based
mhm,
on what we're seeing from a, tooling and adoption perspective out in the ether.
mm. I think that insider thing is really important because it's very hard not to be considered disingenuous. And I think if you don't talk the language of the people saying, look, this is why this is a good idea, that's when you get the
Right.
pushback.
Right.
Because essentially you're basically otherwise coming into market going, oh, you're doing it wrong. We can help you get it
Correct.
right.
Correct. Yeah. And I think there's certainly, and we try to do this as humbly as possible because, the thing that you find talking to more business owners is like, none of this stuff is easy. Everybody's been on an incredible journey themselves, whether that's, personal, professional, et cetera. It's one of my favorite parts of the job, actually, is just talking to, agency owners about their journey. And I think for us, you've got to approach every one of these relationships with a deep amount of empathy, and kind of leave that ego at the door. Like, yes, we come from the space, absolutely, but we are humbled regularly. And so I think for us, it's a combination of both having some of that credibility from, kind of been there, done that type of environments, but also entering the conversations with enough empathy to know these folks live a totally different day to day than we do, and we can learn something from every single conversation. So we try to bring that into our own operating model.
Yeah. What's one thing I wanted to get your lens on is and it's probably from your time at Oscar, and this is, like I say, clearly not about being a criticism of Oscar, but one of those things is when you become digitally native, tech, very sort of bleeding edge on tech. But when you become like an Oscar and you've got 10, 12 years into the journey, how do you avoid kind of that sort of legacy debt or legacy cultural debt as well? Did
Yeah.
you see? I mean, I'm only using Oscar as an example because you were 10 years there and you would have seen
Yeah.
that challenge firsthand. But has that made you think about how you would tackle that in this journey?
It's interesting. I think that a lot of the early Oscar employees all kind of came together because they were both ridiculously high intellectual horsepower, but also ridiculously high in missionary orientation. And so I think, culturally, you had both those that wanted to work hard, work together to solve a big problem with a huge market opportunity. But I think you also had that paired with a really deep ambition and love for what the mission of the organization was, which in many respects was trying to make the consumer experience in healthcare far better than it was before Oscar started. And so I actually think that same cultural ethos is what we are trying to build here, right? Being kind of students of this industry, having a deep appreciation and empathy for the stakeholders that play within this ecosystem. Like, one of the things you'll find is I've yet to find anybody that's trying to do a bad job. The more folks you talk to, we, of course, we'll talk on panels and at various, forums on, who might be not necessarily pulling their weight in the system. The thing that you find out the more folks you talk to is everybody's kind of trying to bust their whats to try to make things better. And so what we're trying to do is pull together a series of folks that are excited about the opportunity to have an impact on that system. And I think many of the early Oscar hires, like I said, have those factors that made up the culture that I think we're trying to build upon here at Gyde. And so it's not a giant surprise that a lot of folks have Oscar in their CV, but in some ways it's a similar mission, but simply tackling it from a different vantage point with a different set of technological tooling behind us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that DNA of a business, it's no surprise. There's a podcast of mine that, we're recording this on a day where a different podcast has gone out, and
Yeah.
we were talking about Uncork. So on the P&C side, there's so many people that started businesses that
Yep.
came out of that Uncork, like Cadre. You're starting to see it with Oscar, like Oscar. Well, we're not starting to see it with
Yeah.
Oscar. You get these companies in the space that just have loads of people that spill out, and mainly they seem to share one thing, which is the DNA of, can we do it better? Can we do it fast enough? Can we make a difference here? So
Yep.
yeah, it's an interesting thing actually. I mean, obviously in my world, we do staffing and we find talent for early stage businesses, and the amount of time we spend focused on the what this person brings to the table from a skills perspective quite low. Really, it's kind of, well, it's quite not. I wouldn't say low. It's loose. It might be like, oh, we
Close.
need we need the best person to face out with our clients, but sometimes that person comes from product. That person comes from customer success, from sales. And
Yeah.
it's just, are they right for this stage of business? So I find that stuff fascinating. On the other side of that, the agency partners that you're trying to bring in, what makes a good agency partner? And I'm kind of intrigued. This is sort of second part of how many come to you versus you go to them, and does it change how easily they sort of onboard into the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a mix. I do think, at least right now, we are probably skewing more towards, a younger partner cohort. I think whether that's because of kind of their buy-in to, I think, what we're trying to achieve, or, I think the embrace of some of the technology and its ability to kind of impact the system. Who knows? Could be either. What I would say generally, though, is we like folks that are servicing largely kind of Medicare Advantage or employee benefit profiles. Health is very much kind of our entry point where we're starting. But I think beyond that, one thing I say all the time is the person or the people is a lot more important than the P&L. And so we're really trying to find partners that are buying into what we're trying to achieve. And so, things we're looking for. Folks are really optimizing for upside and the potential to really create change, both economically and from an experience and a systemic perspective. Those are folks that seem to align better with what we're trying to do. For those that, and I, for what it's worth, have a deep respect for the folks that need to do this, but for those that are trying to truly kind of sell the business and kind of buy out, you kind of hear the things they're asking for in the context of the deal, et cetera. We might not be the right fit at this point in time. And so, one of the things we talk about all the time internally is this notion of finding, owner partners that want to buy in versus buy out. And I think you see that come through in the deal. If they're, highly optimized for long-term upside and value creation, that's probably a partner that's fairly aligned with what you're trying to accomplish. If you find that they're highly optimized for kind of downside protection or, any of the things that might come through in that manner, then there's many other buyers out there that I think would be a better fit. And by the way, that is okay. I actually think that's very healthy that there's options for many owners out there that are trying to determine what to do with respect to the future vision for their own business. And I respect that it's an incredibly important decision. I'm not shy about telling folks that my grandparents were small business owners for 40 years in the restaurant industry, and these things are like children many times. And so I'll never fault an owner ever for wanting to go a certain direction with respect to their own company, because these are just such big decisions for them and their families and really take years of work to get them to where they are. So, I think, like I said, in many respects, it's healthy that there's a lot of options in the ecosystem. I'm glad that Gyde can be a very different one, because I think too often we run into owners that say, finally, there is something like Gyde out there, when the other options were probably suboptimal from their perspective.
It's being effective as well. I mean, this is a space we know quite well. Not so much in my most recent career, and because we work with insurtech startups and scale-ups, but I started a search firm over 10 years ago, very traditional insurance, did lots of kind of small brokers, small MGAs, lots of acquisition basically by team, and always the frustration was how to get a sensible exit, what was the right partner, and the amount of times it went wrong by they were choosing the wrong partner, and then they get rolled up into
Right.
this bigger business and just not want to be there. And essentially, it's they'd chosen their own prison was the way that there was a phrase someone used that stuck with me.
Chosen their own prison. It's too
Yeah,
funny.
I know.
We hear stories like this all the time.
Yeah, and it's tough, and I think the one thing that's great is that you've got this USP to offer them as well. I mean, most of the time people are coming in going, yeah, I'm part of a bigger pool, probably access to different equipment and staff, etc. But you're going,
Right.
yeah, but imagine what you could do with a modern tool set and a modern-minded business as well. We talked about future state a little bit and different products. How far along is that, and how far are you going to go with that? Because obviously, once you've got this relationship with the customer,
Right.
excuse me, there's really no limit to what you could go and offer that person, because you're taking a lot of the heavy lifting and kind of pricing and market work away from them by doing AI native. So yeah, what's the sort of future state of that as you see it?
Can you ask the question just slightly differently, Alex, to make sure I get you the right answer?
I was more talking about different lines of business.
Yeah.
Once you've got a relationship with a customer, you could tell them there isn't really a limit, but do you want to
Yeah.
deviate too far away from that? Yeah. I
Yeah.
asked that in the most terrible way possible.
No. I think it's right on. So I think one way to think about it initially is moving through what we'd call kind of the licensure stack, for lack of a better term, is like one place to start. So if you're, partnering largely with those that are selling health insurance, well, look, what else can they sell with, health insurance license? Oftentimes it's life and health, right? So like just working through that kind of funnel, one is ancillary products for sure. Oftentimes they're not offering as many of those. Two is, I think they can look at life, final expense, annuity products, et cetera. All of those are kind of within the core kind of, life and health insurance licensure stack. And, the natural place to start is, of course, there. Within P&C, I think those are things that we certainly want to do, and those will be kind of more future facing. But, I think for us, the wealth and actually health components are equally as interesting. So, I think we're all thinking about how to sequence those things over the next 2 to 3 years. But, the most natural kind of next iterations, as you think about even what's in the existing cross-sell infrastructure today, it's really working down that licensure stack.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I was wondering how ambitious we're going to go in the future, but I'm sure there's no limit to that. But stick to your knitting, as we like to say in the UK. So
I think for us, we're trying to be incredibly ambitious over a 10-year period of time and incredibly
yeah,
focused over a 1-year period.
yeah, it's what's that phrase that you're amazed what you can get done over a year versus what you can do in a day.
Yes.
Which I honestly I have to remind myself that, and I think that's the thing that's not talked about enough, particularly in startups and scale ups. And it doesn't matter how much money you raise; it's the thing of
Right.
it's easy to think you're not moving forward, or lose track of kind of where you need to be going, and that's
Yeah.
something that we see all the time. I'm conscious of time actually. Well, I knew we'd do this, and we've kind of skipped along, but you know, what is next? You're pushing things out. Where should people reach out to? Give us the next 12 months, and what you're looking to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think for us, the next 12 months, we're pretty focused on kind of like three core pillars. One is largely, I think, complete, which is rounding out our team. We've brought on some additional leaders, even at the CTO level, Andrew Schultz, who we recently hired, Frederick as our head of M&A, we recently brought on, really kind of rounding out that core leadership team is, I think, a key focus for us. But as we think about, the next two pillars, I think those will increasingly be like the sole two focuses. One is finding great partners to bring into the business, right? The business kind of begins with M&A, and to do that, you've got to find the right people first and foremost to bring into the company as kind of your partners. And then that final pillar is just accelerating our AI, platform and application roadmap, such that after you're, acquiring these partners, you're giving them the tooling that you promised them as a part of that process, and not only just what you promised them, but delivering well above that. So those two items will increasingly be huge focus areas for us. Given that, look, we've already got a number of partners that are around the table today that should close over the next quarter. It's really now just about accelerating some of the early proof points we put on the board.
Great stuff. Great stuff. It's really exciting, and I think we're going to see similar attempts of a business like this. But I think particularly what's interesting to me is the space that you've chosen to go into, because it feels so. I'm slightly biased by my lens because I have an investment in this space, but we don't do as much. We're much more on the P&C side. We
Yeah,
do,
yeah.
but the reason we are is because we've just seen less investment in that side of the market. There's not been
We
as
don't
much
see as
money
much.
invested. No, like technology, and the same with reinsurance. I mean, we've got a few kind of reinsurance related. It's all been sitting in P&C. And then what's amazing
Totally.
about this side of the market is that it's so complex for the consumer. Like it's such a necessary kind of evolution of what we're looking for, and we don't see it. I mean, I want to see it in, just selfishly in the UK, we buy everything through comparison sites pretty much on the personal line side. But the one thing that's always missing on that is the advisory of the quality of the insurance you're buying. Is
Right.
it the cover you need? And it's where the broker used to fill in a role. But now we've made everything about price, and you look, and to the layman, it's like, oh, I'm buying some travel insurance, and it looks as good as that one. I'm buying some household, and I'm not. And particularly, that's one thing to kind of have the security for travel. But I know from bad luck and needing health cover, and particularly not getting it in the US, and that was mainly because I just didn't have the right cover. And if I had the right cover, I'd
Totally.
probably still be in New York. Um,
Totally.
which is great. Will, absolute pleasure. Are we going to get to see you at any of the conferences? Are you doing much travel, or
Bunch of travel. We'll be
yeah,
at Medicarians, various NABIP events across the country. We'll be at Benefits Pros, so we'll be out there. And of course, look, we're calling owners on a regular basis. We've got teams here in office in Austin, Texas, and New York that are conducting that outreach, and then of course building product and support plans for those partners. When they come on board. So we'll be out and very public in the market, but folks likely hearing from us anyways.
great stuff. Well, look, if you're an agency owner or want to be a partner, then please reach out to Will. Well, thank you very much for being a guest on the Leadership and Insurance podcast.
Awesome, Alex. Thanks for having me.